So I will start just very with the basics of the European of the Digital Services Act and what it is. As many of you know, it's a landmark content and platform governance law that was adopted in 2022 and is just becoming fully applicable in a few weeks, on the 17th of February, to all actors that it's regulating. But it has already become, it has sort of layered approach to different actors, and in terms of applicability, it also started to apply to the biggest online platforms already in August 2023. And this is a law that aimed to modernize EU's existing legal framework when it comes to content, when it comes to intermediary liability, content governance, and make it more fit to respond to the new challenges that emerged with big social media platforms. And the key objectives of this law is really to create a safe online space for everybody in the EU that is using digital services in the EU, to limit the spread of illegal content, to introduce due process when different digital services, online platforms, hosting services make content moderation decisions, whether to, for instance, remove certain types of content, to ensure that there is algorithmic transparency, accountability when it comes to the use of algorithms for content moderation, for content recommendation, and for targeted advertising. And then as well, it has a strong element of empowering users vis-a-vis these online services providers, and giving them really more rights to and a stronger position vis-a-vis these companies. And as you can see here in the picture, it applies to different categories of actors, to a broad range of digital services, which range from regular websites to internet infrastructure services, through hosting services, to online platforms. And a specific category that I would want to focus on is the category of very large online platforms, which are companies that have more than 45 million average monthly active users in the EU. And this law specifically recognizes the fact that these platforms, these biggest platforms, they hold the most power in the information ecosystem, and they also should be, that power should be met with the biggest responsibility and the biggest kind of obligations and measures to keep those platforms accountable. And just to bring some names on who are we even talking about when it comes to those very large online platforms. As of January 2024, these are the companies that have been designated by the European Commission as very large online platforms, VLOPs, or very, very large online search engines, because that's also a category that falls under the scope of the DSA. You'll see many familiar names here. The most recent kind of wave of designations included also big porn websites. So that is also a very interesting sort of development in the EU to have to see all those big platforms regulated in the DSA. And in terms of obligations, as I mentioned, the DSA adopts this sort of layered approach where it varies the different obligations based on the type of actor and also the size of that actor. I will not go into great detail here because, as you can see, there are many of different due diligence obligations, transparency obligations, accountability obligations that are imposed on different actors. I wanted to focus on specifically on highlight a couple of obligations that I think are the most interesting or the most promising as well from the point of view of civil society and the protection of human rights online. I believe that Eliška later on in her presentation she'll focus more on the content moderation aspect, so I will maybe highlight those other obligations that I think are interesting. The first one is the mandatory transparency of algorithms that are used both for content moderation and in recommender systems. That is a very interesting development, that users have to be informed about the main parameters, for instance, of recommender systems that platforms are using to recommend content to them. And also the law imposes on those very large online platforms to give the users the possibility to choose a recommender system which does not rely on profiling to recommend content. DSA also mandates more transparency on targeted advertising. That is also a very big element of the DSA and something that civil society have been very much involved in terms of restricting the amount of personal data and profiling that is happening for that purpose. So that transparency, first of all, we are talking about transparency, and that includes transparency vis-a-vis individual users. So individual users of different online platforms have to be informed about why they are seeing a specific ad, why the specific ad has been targeted to them. But there is also an element of public transparency that is more aimed towards civil society, towards the broader general public, towards researchers, journalists. And the DSA mandates the creation of a public repository of all online advertising that is presented on the platform, together with the amounts of money that have been spent on those ads, the categories of people that these ads reached, the categories of people that the advertisers wanted to target. So that is all designed to sort of cast more light at this very opaque ecosystem of targeted advertising within online platforms. Interestingly, it also creates some restrictions for targeted advertising. So it explicitly prohibits targeting ads based on profiling using sensitive data, sensitive categories of data, which are data like ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, political views, and so very kind of sensitive information about people that can be either observed or inferred about them that cannot be used for online advertising. Another interesting mechanism, I think, to highlight is the access to data for researchers. So some researchers will have some sort of privileged access to data that are held by the platform precisely in order to research what is happening, what are the risks that are emerging on those platforms, and how to best measure them. And finally, something that I wanted to highlight is this obligation for online platforms, for the biggest online platforms, to conduct risk assessments. And those essentially online platforms and search engines, they have to conduct yearly self-assessments into any systemic risks that are stemming from the design or the use of their service. And those systemic risks, they include issues such as the spread of illegal content, but also any negative effects on fundamental rights. And this is a very promising, we see it as a very promising mechanism to address a lot of the impacts and the negative consequences that we have seen from the way that very large online platforms have been functioning in the last years. And in response to those assessments, they must adopt effective mitigation measures to address those risks, in particular those negative aspects and impacts to fundamental rights. When performing risk assessments, they are also encouraged to consult with users of the services, with groups that are impacted by their services, with independent experts and with civil society. It has been, it's not a very clear legal requirement. It's more a recommendation to online platforms to involve meaningfully stakeholders in that process. And so far, from what we know, that hasn't really happened with the first round of risk assessment. So we are very keen to see whether that will happen in the second round and in the future of risk assessments. And then finally, when it comes to the oversight and scrutiny of these risk assessments, they will be subject to external independent audits, which are, I expect, currently underway. And they are also subject to scrutiny by the European Commission, which is the enforcement body for those biggest platforms. So the enforcement has been, in a way, centralized at the EU level for those biggest platforms.
Karolina, can
yes,
I ask you a quick question?
Of course.
Of those, because you mentioned the obligation, is there an obligation to disclose the risk assessments, or is that just something that is sent to the European Commission who does the scrutiny?
Yeah, so following those independent audits, the platforms will have to publish the summary of findings from those risk assessments. So not the whole risk assessment, unfortunately. This is something that we were fighting for as civil society, but eventually did not manage to achieve in the final text of the law. But some sort of summary will be expected. Now, we haven't seen those risk assessments yet. The Commission already has received them. And we expect that the summaries will be published sometime later this year, towards the end of the year. But again, and this I think is actually a good segue, Anita, to what I wanted to now expand on in terms of our work on risk assessments. That is one of the recommendations that we actually have to the platforms and to the European Commission to ensure that there is meaningful transparency of those risk assessments, even though the DSA doesn't explicitly mandate that in a full unredacted version of the risk assessments. There is nothing in the way for platforms to do that voluntarily, but also for those summaries of findings, we also expect a certain level of information, a certain level of detail that would allow external stakeholders to scrutinize how those risk assessments were performed. So just a bit of a background on what I'm talking about is together with Access Now, so Eliška, who's also here on the call, we developed some recommendations for the European Commission primarily, but also indirectly to online platforms themselves as well, on how to conduct on some minimal requirements for meaningful risk assessments. So we are worried that platforms are going to treat this mechanism of risk assessments as a purely compliance box-ticking exercise. And at the same time, impact assessments, we see a very big potential for actually addressing negative fundamental rights effects of the functioning of online platforms. So we have developed some sort of minimum benchmarks, minimum requirements that we would expect from platforms to engage in when conducting those risk assessments in order to prevent them from becoming some sort of like meaningless bureaucracy exercise. So this is we have a link here for to the full paper. We'll of course share it with you afterwards. So I will not get into a lot of detail, just an overview of the recommendations that we included there. First of all, we recommend that those impact assessments, they are grounded in the EU Charter of Fundamental Rights, which includes an exhaustive list of fundamental rights that are protected, should be protected by the EU and by extension also by online platforms. In terms of scope, understanding that there will be certain fundamental rights that will be more affected or more impacted than others. Nevertheless, we argue that those impact assessments, they have to identify all negative effects on all fundamental rights and not sort of arbitrarily pick and choose which of those fundamental rights will be assessed. We also expect those risk assessments to contain significant amount of detail and essential information about actually the services, the systems and processes that are under assessment, including as well the methodology of the risk assessment. Because ultimately, for the European Commission to be able to scrutinize whether those risk assessments have been performed in a way that is meaningful, that has accurately identified all potential risks, and then to accurately apply different mitigation measures, they have to understand essentially how the systems function, how they are interconnected as well between each other, and how those most pressing negative effects on fundamental rights have been identified and assessed. So currently under the DSA, an important point there is that there is no specific methodology that the DSA mandates for fundamental rights impact assessments. There is no specific guidance also that the Commission has to adopt when it comes to those risk assessments. And from our conversations with online platforms, it has been clear when the DSA came into effect that they are also sort of at a loss in terms of the common standard or the common expectation for those risk assessments. So we are only going to see, I suppose, after the first risk assessments are completed and evaluated, whether there emerges certain best practices for those risk assessments. However, we argue that the Commission nevertheless should establish a certain sort of minimum level, minimum benchmark for basically how these risk assessments are supposed to be conducted to ensure accurate risk identification and facilitate future oversight and accountability. So we are going to also continue our advocacy towards the European Commission to harmonize this process, essentially. And last but not least, one of our main recommendations as well in the paper is that in order to identify accurately different risks that platforms and their services pose, it's essential to consult with the users, with the people who are communities who are impacted by those services, and with civil society. That is not a very clear obligation under the DSA, but nevertheless, there are already grounds for requiring that from online platforms. And we hope that in the future, that consultation will be more robust. As I know, there really hasn't been any consultation so far. So that's where I will finish on the risk assessment. As I mentioned, just to clarify the timeline, the first risk assessment has already took place. Platforms had to deliver it by in the end of August of 2023. And we are sort of halfway between the first risk assessment and the second risk assessment. And we hope that we haven't, we don't have a lot of information, we haven't seen the risk assessments, but we are planning to conduct interviews as well with online platforms to better understand how they went about it. And we also are in continued dialogue with the European Commission as well to better understand what systemic risks have been identified, for instance, or what mitigation measures platforms have deployed as a response to those risks. Very, very briefly, because I know I'm a bit over time, it was also you also asked about the interplay of the DSA with the GDPR. I think so the General Data Protection Regulation of the EU, which I believe might be also a confusing aspect of how these two big regulations interplay with each other. Essentially, these two laws have different objectives. So they are designed to complement rather to overlap with each other. The GDPR is focused on data protection, while the DSA is more focused on intermediary liability, on content and platform governance, and on consumer protection. Obviously, there will be certain overlaps in terms of how platforms process personal data, but the GDPR primarily applies in this case, and the DSA does not modify to any extent the GDPR. So any requirements of the GDPR in terms of consent, in terms of legal basis, in terms of complaints that individuals can bring in front of data protection authorities, that remains still applicable to online platforms. Similarly, I was talking a lot about risk assessments. You might be aware that under the GDPR, there is this notion of data protection impact assessments. Again, they are separate. They are separate instruments. However, they both should complement and inform each other. And we are very much arguing for kind of harmonization in companies to ensure that these different due diligence processes, they work together, and that they are not separate compliance exercises, but rather that they work together to protect human rights to the best possible extent. The only aspect, I mean, the most, I think, obvious aspect of the interplay between the DSA and the GDPR is targeted advertising, to the extent that targeted advertising is using personal data. So as I mentioned before, the DSA explicitly prohibits advertising based on profiling and using special categories of sensitive data, which might have not been clear enough under the GDPR. It's not the case that under the GDPR it was already allowed. Rather, it was the case of interpretation and providing some more legal clarity and stronger protection for consumers in this case, for users of online platforms. And there is also a different enforcement structure. The GDPR is enforced by the national data protection authorities. The DSA is enforced for those biggest platforms by the European Commission, and then in member states by different authorities are not necessarily DPAs. I don't know if there are any questions on this point. But my last, I think Anita, you have something.
No, go ahead, please go ahead.
Yeah, okay. So just the final slide is about a couple of recommendations for investors. specifically when it comes to risk assessments and how we believe they can be used to keep companies accountable. So first of all, we would encourage you to push companies to conduct meaningful risk assessments, which are not just a compliance exercise, but rather a meaningful reflection on the impacts that these services have on the society and for human rights, and also utilize and leverage risk assessments in making companies accountable to investors. There is also a recommendation to demand clear commitments for effective mitigation measures for those risks that have been identified, including, if necessary, to actually phase out or completely change certain features that are causing risks which cannot be mitigated effectively. And then some recommendations that I've already kind of mentioned when it comes to mechanisms within the DSA that are, in my opinion, not strong enough and could be strengthened through pressure from the side of investors, which is, for instance, transparency, so something that I mentioned already, meaningful stakeholder engagement, as well as an important aspect is that the DSA is very often seen by, so online platforms obviously have the tendency to put more efforts and resources into regions where there are robust legislation, such as in the EU, the Digital Services Act, because they obviously can be faced with legal risks and fines. But it's important that platforms commit to offer equal protection to users from outside of the EU, especially in global majority countries, and to make sure that the resources are not sort of taken away from ensuring also safety and accountability vis-a-vis users in global majority countries. So I finish here. If I'm happy to answer any questions, here's my email as well for any follow-up. Be happy to connect. Thank you very much.